Hello, my friends. My name is Robert Morgan, or Caesar. Greetings to all my colleagues at the channel, both old and new. To avoid any misunderstanding, this channel is a radio station with many content creators. So, if you'd like to hear me again, go to the channel in the playlist under the name Robert Morgan. Welcome to The Meat Grinder. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep my fingers locked around the freezing steel of my Webley frame. My knuckles turned completely ghost white against the iron. I could feel every tiny tremor running through my fingers, and the harder I tried to force my hand steady, the worse it became. It wasn't just the cold anymore. There was something about the silence surrounding that cottage that made my body react before my mind could understand why. We were crouched low in the wet, rotting ditch behind a collapsing oak fence out in the middle of nowhere, Norbury, a dead quiet stretch of countryside where nobody comes looking for trouble unless they brought it with them. The rain wasn't just falling, it was coming down sideways, whipping off the trees and stinging my face like a handful of thrown gravel. My boots had sunk 3 inches into the freezing mud, and every time I tried to shift my weight, the earth pulled back like it wanted to drag me into a ditch. The mud was cold enough to numb my ankles, but I barely noticed it. What I noticed was the feeling that we weren't alone. There was no sound behind us, no movement in the trees, nothing I could see through the curtains of rain, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something was standing just beyond the fence, somewhere in that black wall of branches, watching us without making a sound. Every few seconds I caught myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a face between the trees. There was never anything there. That somehow made it worse. 10 yards out across the flooded grass sat the cottage. It was this crooked, decaying Victorian nightmare looming up against the pitch-black sky, its timber framing rotted black and its roof sagging like a snapped spine. The windows were dark except for that single upper pane, and the darkness around them seemed strangely heavy, almost solid. It felt less like we were looking at an abandoned house, and more like the house was looking back at us. Holmes was pressed right up against my left shoulder in the dead brush. His dark wool coat was completely waterlogged, dripping heavy streams of ice-cold water onto his collar, but his face was rigid as marble. His eyes were pinned onto that second-story window like a pair of high-beam lights cutting through fog. I followed his gaze. For several seconds there was nothing. Then, out of nowhere, it slammed right up against the filthy glass. A face. Jesus. It didn't even look like something born of a woman. It was this flat, sickly, waxy yellow slate, totally devoid of features. No eyebrows, no skin texture, no jawline. Just a dead yellow slab with 2 dark, hollow cutouts where eyes should have been and a frozen, grotesque red slit carved across the bottom like a permanent scream. It sat there behind the pane, totally still, staring down into the dark ditch where we were hiding like a corpse pressed against the glass. My stomach tightened. I realized I had stopped breathing. The thing didn't blink. It didn't move closer. It didn't move away. It simply remained there. That was what frightened me most, because even from 10 yards away, I had the sickening impression that it knew exactly where each of us was hiding. I could almost feel those empty black hollows passing over Holmes, then me, then Monroe, as if the face wasn't looking at the ditch at all, but directly through the darkness and straight into our thoughts. Monroe, our client, was sitting right behind me on his knees, dragging in air so hard his lungs sounded like rusty bellows. He choked out a sob, slapping his hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. His fingers were trembling violently against his lips. Holmes didn't flinch, didn't shift his stance, didn't even blink. I watched the yellow face. For one terrible second, I thought the red slit moved. I couldn't tell whether it actually happened or whether my frightened brain had simply invented movement where there was none. I stared until my eyes watered from the rain, but the face remained exactly the same, blank and patient. Holmes just reached into the lining of his trench coat, pulled out a short iron crowbar with a taped handle, turned his head toward me in the blackness, and barked under his breath. "Watson, if that thing up there has a heartbeat, we're tearing this joint apart. If it doesn't, we aren't walking out of Surrey alive." The words settled over me worse than the rain. I tightened my grip around the Webley and looked back toward the window. The face was still there. If you wanted to understand how we ended up knee-deep in Norbury mud, you had to rewind the tape back 3 days to our flat at 221B Baker Street. It was classic London miserable outside, a pea soup fog so thick and greasy you could practically slice it with a butter knife, smelling like coal smoke, river silt, and horse manure. I was sitting in the worn leather armchair by the fireplace, rubbing my left knee where a bullet from my army days in Afghanistan still acts up whenever the temperature drops below freezing. The ache had settled deep into the joint, but that night, even the familiar pain couldn't keep my attention for long. Across the rug, Holmes was slumped in his chair, wearing that ratty purple dressing gown, holding his Stradivarius like a butcher holds a cleaver. He wasn't playing music, he was dragging the bow across the strings in these screeching, erratic jabs, trying to burn off the restless energy that builds up in his skull whenever his brain runs out of crime to dissect. The sound made the room feel smaller. Every shriek of the violin seemed to disappear into the fog outside, swallowed by the heavy curtains and the dark windows. The gaslight flickered occasionally, and each time it did, I found myself glancing toward the glass. Nothing, just fog. Still, there was something unnerving about the night. London had its usual noises, carriages somewhere in the distance, footsteps disappearing along Baker Street, muffled voices, the occasional engine coughing through the wet streets. But beneath all of it was an unusual emptiness. I was about 2 minutes away from throwing a boot at his head when the front door downstairs took an absolute beating. It wasn't some polite, gentle knuckle tap. It was a heavy, desperate pounding, the kind of frantic slamming a guy does when he's got a pack of wolves chewing on his coat sleeves. The noise shook the floorboards clear up to the mantelpiece. Holmes stopped the bow halfway across the strings. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then the pounding came again. 3 blows. Hard. Fast. Desperate. Mrs. Hudson didn't even have time to clear the bottom landing before the guy smashed past her and came sprinting up the creaking stairs. His footsteps came too quickly, slipping and stumbling against the wood, and for a moment they sounded less like a man climbing stairs and more like something being chased upward. He slammed our door open so hard the brass latch rattled against the frame. Grant Monroe was a big guy, broad shoulders, heavy frame, but right now he looked like a runaway freight train that had just jumped the tracks. His coat was half unbuttoned, his silk tie hung loose around his throat. He had no hat despite the downpour, and his trousers were caked in dry yellow clay from the boots to the knees. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with a raw, unadulterated terror that made his whole face look hollowed out. He staggered across the rug, dropped hard into our visitor's chair, and shoved his face into his shaking palms. I could hear his breathing from across the room. It was too fast, too shallow, like his lungs were afraid to take in too much air. He sat there for 20 seconds, just dragging and ragged, wheezing gasps of air while Holmes set his violin down on the table without making a sound. Holmes watched him closely. I watched Holmes. Neither of us needed to say what we were thinking. Whatever had driven Monroe through the London fog and up those stairs had frightened him badly enough to break through every layer of pride and dignity he possessed. Finally, he lowered his hands. His face looked gray. "Mr. Holmes," Monroe rasped out, his voice cracking down the middle like dry pine. "You gotta help me. Either my cottage is haunted by something evil, or the woman I love is hiding a living nightmare in the dark." The room suddenly felt colder. I glanced toward the window again. The fog pressed against the glass like something waiting outside. And for the first time that night, I wondered whether Monroe had come to Baker Street because he wanted Holmes to solve a mystery, or because he was terrified of going back home alone. Holmes leaned forward in his chair, elbows propped on his knees, lacing his long, thin fingers together under his chin. He didn't offer the guy a glass of brandy, didn't tell him to calm down, didn't do any of that soft bedside manner routine. He just locked those sharp gray eyes onto Monroe like a surgeon examining a tumor and told him to spill the whole story from the jump. There was something almost unnerving about the way Holmes watched him. Monroe couldn't seem to hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. He kept looking toward the door, then the window, then back at Holmes, as if he expected someone to be standing behind him. Monroe wiped a mixture of sweat and rain off his forehead with his coat sleeve, took a heavy breath, and started laying it out. He'd been married to his wife, Effie, for about 3 years. According to him, she was an English girl who'd moved out to the States years back, married some American guy in Georgia, and built a life over there in Atlanta. But then, back in '88, yellow fever swept through the city like wildfire, killing her husband and their infant kid in less than a week. Devastated, Effie packed whatever she had left, caught a steamship back to London, and met Monroe at a resort down in Brighton. Monroe fell for her hard. He described her as this sweet, gentle, fiercely loyal woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. They bought a gorgeous little country cottage down in Norbury, settled into a quiet life, and for 3 years, everything was picture perfect. That was the part that bothered me. People don't usually describe happiness in such perfect terms when they're trying to explain why everything went wrong. Monroe kept rubbing his palms together as he spoke, slowly at first, then faster. But about 3 weeks ago, the gears started grinding. Effie walked into Monroe's study out of nowhere, her face pale as a sheet, and asked him for £100 in crisp, unmarked bank notes. Now, 100 quid back then wasn't pocket change. That was serious money, enough to buy a small fleet of carriages. Monroe loved her to death, so he didn't grill her. He wrote the check, handed over the cash, and didn't ask a single question. But even as he said that, his expression changed. There was regret buried underneath his words. The kind that comes from realizing you gave someone something without knowing what they intended to do with it. But the very next morning, the old abandoned cottage right across the lane from their property, a place that had sat empty, rotting, and shuttered for over a decade, suddenly had smoke rising out of its chimney. A mysterious crew had moved in under the cover of midnight. And from that exact moment, Monroe's sweet suburban life went completely up in flames. He paused there. Nobody spoke. The fire in our grate made a small popping sound. Monroe flinched at it. That tiny reaction bothered me more than his description of the cottage. He wasn't simply frightened. He had reached the point where ordinary sounds had begun to feel dangerous. Holmes noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. I could almost feel the room tightening around us as Monroe continued staring into the fire, his face reflecting the orange glow. 3 weeks ago, he had trusted his wife enough to hand her £100 without questions. Now he was sitting in our room looking like a man who wasn't sure he knew the woman sleeping beside him. And somewhere across the lane from his cottage, strangers had moved into a house that had been empty for 10 years. Whatever connection existed between those two things, Monroe clearly feared discovering it. Because sometimes the truth is worse than the suspicion. Monroe gripped the arms of the leather chair so hard his knuckles looked like polished ivory. You could tell every word coming out of his mouth was like pulling teeth. He told us how the paranoia started eating away at his gut like acid. Effie was acting strange, jittery, dodging his questions, checking the front windows every 10 minutes, and slipping out of the house in the middle of the night while she thought he was dead asleep. Monroe said he had started listening for her footsteps. Every night, he would lie awake in the darkness, pretending to sleep while listening to the floorboards creak somewhere beyond the bedroom. Sometimes he heard nothing. Sometimes he heard the faintest movement. And every time, his heart would start hammering before he even knew why. About 2 a.m. 2 nights ago, Monroe couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed, noticed Effie's side was freezing cold, and saw her shadow slipping back through the front gate after visiting that cottage across the road. That detail seemed to drain the last color from his face as he told it. He had been sleeping beside his wife, but at some point during the night she had disappeared without waking him. The lane was dead quiet, save for the wind rattling the dry oak leaves. As he walked past the overgrown front yard of the cottage, he happened to tilt his head up toward the second-story window. There was a single, flickering candle burning on a table inside, and right there, smashed right up against the glass pane, staring straight down into his soul, was the yellow face. Monroe dropped his voice to a whisper, his breath coming in fast, shallow hitches. He said it didn't look like a human head. It was waxy, dead yellow, totally smooth like polished bone, with two dark holes for eyes and this grotesque, fixed red line across the jaw that didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't breathe. It was just hovering there in the faint orange candlelight, staring down at him through the glass like a corpse hanging in a closet. Monroe said a cold sweat broke out all over his body. He could feel his legs becoming weak beneath him, but he forced himself to remain standing. He kept staring at that face. The face didn't react. It didn't need to. That complete lack of movement made it feel almost impossible to understand. A living person would breathe. A living person would blink. A living person would move. This thing simply watched. When he took 3 steps toward the front porch to break the door down, he heard a sharp iron bolt click shut from inside the house. The sound stopped him cold. It was only a small metallic click, but in the dead silence it sounded enormous. Monroe knew someone had heard him. Someone inside had been waiting. Before he could put his shoulder to the oak panel, Effie came sprinting out of the dark trees behind him, threw her arms around his waist, collapsed on her knees in the mud, and begged him with tears streaming down her face to walk away and never, ever look at that window again. Monroe said he could still remember the pressure of her fingers around him. He could still hear the panic in her voice. But what stayed with him most was the window, because when Effie pulled him away, Monroe looked back one last time. The candle was still burning. The yellow face was still there, and it hadn't moved an inch. He told us that was the moment he stopped believing he was dealing with something ordinary, not because he knew what was inside the cottage, but because he had begun to understand that whatever was happening there had been happening while he was asleep, inside his own home, only a few yards from where he kept his wife. By this point, Monroe was practically vibrating with nervous energy, pacing back and forth across the Persian rug in our sitting room. He told us that after 2 days of sitting in his own house feeling like a lunatic, the tension inside his head snapped like a dry twig. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't look his wife in the eye without seeing that yellow mask staring back at him. Every time Effie entered a room, Monroe watched her hands. Every time she opened a drawer, he wondered what she was looking for. Every time she glanced toward the window, his stomach tightened. The worst part was that he couldn't tell whether his fear was warning him about something real or slowly destroying his ability to think clearly. So yesterday afternoon, while Effie was down at the local village market buying groceries, Monroe grabbed a heavy oak walking stick from the hallway stand, marched straight across the muddy lane, and kicked the front door of the cottage right off its rusted hinges. The door flew back with a deafening crash. He stepped into the front hall, his stick raised, ready to crack the skull of whatever intruder was squatting on the land. For several seconds, he stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No voices. Only the rain tapping against the broken doorway behind him. The place was an absolute dump. Dust thick on the floorboards, cobwebs hanging down like gray curtains, smelling like damp rot, moldy straw, and heavy carbolic disinfectant. The smell caught in his throat. He charged up the creaking stairs, shoved the main bedroom door open, and aimed his stick at the dark corner. Nothing. The room was completely empty. Whoever had been staring out that window had vanished like smoke. The emptiness itself seemed wrong. Monroe said the room felt as though someone had only just left it, as though the air still remembered their presence. The bed had been slept in, A pair of worn leather boots sat by the cold fireplace, but the occupant was gone. He stood there for several seconds, staring at those boots. They looked ordinary. That somehow frightened him more. The only thing left behind in the middle of the room was a rough pine table holding an unlit oil lamp and a scrap of paper that had been partially burned and tossed toward the hearth. Monroe pulled that scrap of paper out of his waistcoat pocket right there in 221B and slapped it down on Holmes's mahogany desk. It was a scorched piece of heavy bond paper, the top and left edges blackened by fire, with a frantic, shaky message written across the center in dark ink. For God's sake, keep her hidden. If he finds out, everything is finished. Holmes leaned closer. Monroe didn't speak. Neither did I. The words sat there between us. Keep her hidden. Not protect her. Not save her. Keep her hidden. There was something deeply unsettling about those words because they suggested the person writing them wasn't afraid of Effie. They were afraid of someone finding her. Holmes examined the paper in silence. Monroe kept staring at it as though he wished he had never brought it through our door. I remember thinking that the strangest thing about the whole affair wasn't the yellow face. It wasn't the abandoned cottage. It wasn't even the secret meetings. It was the possibility that Effie might not be the victim at all. And somewhere beneath Monroe's fear, I suspected he had begun thinking the same thing. Holmes didn't pick up the paper with his hands right away. He grabbed his brass tweezers, lifted the burnt scrap by its uncharred corner, and held it inches from his eye under the bright beam of his desktop lamp. He flipped it over, examined the grain of the paper, smelled the burnt edge, and then let out a low, cold whistle through his teeth. The sound made Monroe stiffen. Holmes didn't look bothered at all. In fact, that sleepy, indifferent look he gets when he's bored was completely gone, replaced by that razor-sharp, predatory focus I knew all too well. He started pacing up and down the rug, his long bathrobe trailing behind him like a cape, stuffing shredded shag tobacco into his black clay pipe and lighting it until the entire sitting room was filled with thick, suffocating clouds of blue smoke. Monroe followed him with his eyes. I watched Holmes. There was something unsettling about the transformation. One moment Holmes looked almost amused by the problem. The next, he looked like a man who had finally found something dangerous enough to hold his full attention. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder now, each movement of its hands cutting through the silence like a warning neither Monroe nor I wanted to acknowledge. I became aware of how quiet the street outside had become. No carriage wheels, no footsteps, nothing. For a brief moment, I had the strange sensation that the darkness beyond the curtains was listening to us, waiting patiently for us to leave the safety of the room. Monroe followed him with his eyes, but I noticed his fingers tightening against the arms of his chair. He seemed afraid to look toward the window. I understood why. Neither of us could forget the face that had been there. "Watson," he said, stopping dead in his tracks and turning to me with a look that could cut through steel. "This isn't a supernatural affair. Ghosts don't send notes written in iron gall ink. They don't buy carbolic acid to scrub floorboards. And they sure as hell don't require 100 pounds in crisp Bank of England notes." The certainty in his voice should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because if Holmes was right, then the yellow face wasn't some impossible thing. It was a person who had been hiding in the dark, a person who knew Effie, a person who might know Monroe, and somewhere in that realization was something worse than the idea of a ghost. A living man could watch. A living man could wait. A living man could know exactly when we were coming. He turned to Monroe and laid out his deduction like a prosecutor reading an indictment. Holmes believed Effie's story about her first husband dying in Atlanta was a total fabrication. His theory was cold and brutal. The American husband hadn't died of yellow fever at all. He was a ruthless, desperate criminal who had tracked Effie across the Atlantic, found out she'd married a wealthy English gentleman, and was now squatting in that cottage, using some hideous physical disfigurement or disease to blackmail her for every shilling Monroe possessed. Monroe swallowed hard. For several seconds he didn't answer. His eyes had become fixed on the paper. Holmes continued. "The yellow face at the window, Watson," Holmes said, leaning against the mantelpiece, "is the face of a man ruined by vice or disease, hiding in the dark, bleeding this poor woman dry. And tonight, we're going to tear his mask off." I looked at the yellowed paper again. I wanted to believe Holmes. His explanation was rational. It had structure. It had motive. It had a human face behind the horror. But something about the description still bothered me. The stillness. The blank yellow skin. Those dark holes where the eyes should have been. I didn't say any of that. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Monroe rose slowly from his chair. The room suddenly felt smaller. For an instant, I found myself listening for something beneath the ordinary sounds of the room. A floorboard shifting, a breath behind the wall, perhaps even the faintest movement beyond the window. Nothing came. That silence somehow felt worse. Whatever waited for us in Norbury was no longer a mystery we could discuss safely from the comfort of Baker Street. We were going back to that cottage, and I had the growing feeling that whatever Holmes expected to find behind that yellow face would be waiting for us. By noon the following day, we were sitting in a second-class smoking carriage on the Southeastern Railway, hurtling down towards Surrey. The weather outside was downright oppressive, a low, leaden sky sagging over the countryside, dumping a steady, freezing rain that rattled against the glass like thrown sand. The sound was relentless. It followed us mile after mile. Monroe sat hunched over in the far corner of the compartment, staring out at the passing green fields and bare winter trees, chewing his thumb knuckles until they were raw and bleeding. He looked like a man heading straight to the gallows. Every now and then his eyes would snap toward the window as though he expected to see something moving alongside the train. There was never anything there. Only rain, only fields, only trees bending beneath the wind. But the way he watched the countryside made the compartment feel strangely enclosed. At times, I caught myself watching the dark reflections in the glass instead of the landscape beyond it, half expecting another shape to appear behind us. Whenever the train passed beneath a stand of trees, the windows briefly became black mirrors, and for those few seconds I could see all three of us sitting there, motionless, trapped inside the carriage. It was an unpleasant thought that stayed with me long after the trees were gone. Holmes sat across from him, swaddled in his heavy Inverness cape, his deerstalker hat pulled down low over his brows. He didn't speak a single word for 40 miles. He just sat there with his chin resting squarely against his chest, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, running through every variable and tactical contingency in his head like a grandmaster analyzing a board. The silence between the three of us became almost unbearable. I could hear the wheels beneath us, the hiss of steam, the rain against the window, Monroe's uneven breathing. Nothing else. Yet the longer that silence continued, the more I became convinced that the carriage contained some sound we were failing to hear, something buried beneath the rhythm of the train. I listened harder. There was nothing. That somehow made it worse. I sat next to the window, my right hand buried deep inside my heavy wool overcoat, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of my Webley revolver resting in my side pocket. I brought my thumb over the hammer, making sure the action was smooth, checking the brass heads of the .455 cartridges loaded in the cylinder. The familiar weight should have calmed me. Instead, it reminded me exactly why I had brought it. If Holmes's blackmailer theory was on the money, we weren't going down to Surrey to have a polite chat over tea. We were marching straight into a standoff with a desperate, ruthless fugitive who had everything to lose and zero hesitation about putting a bullet through anyone who got between him and his payoff. I looked across at Monroe. He was still staring through the glass. His reflection stared back at him. For a moment, because of the movement of the train and the rain, his reflected face seemed strangely pale and unfamiliar. I blinked. It was only Monroe, only his reflection. Still, I found myself looking away. The farther we traveled, the harder it became to shake the image from my mind. That yellow face pressed against the glass. The empty eyes. The red line. The absolute stillness. I knew Holmes had given us a reasonable explanation, but reason had a strange way of becoming fragile when you were traveling toward a place where a man had already seen something he could not explain. Monroe suddenly shifted in his seat. Holmes looked up. Neither man spoke. For one terrible second, all three of us seemed to be listening to the same empty silence. The train continued south through the rain. I checked my revolver one last time and pushed my hand deeper into my coat. Norbury was getting closer, and with every mile, the feeling grew stronger that we weren't simply traveling toward an answer. We were traveling toward whatever had been waiting for us since the moment Monroe first looked up at that window. We rolled into the tiny, desolate Norbury station around 4 p.m., just as the miserable gray light was starting to die behind the hills. The platform was completely deserted save for a single station master who looked at us like we were crazy for arriving in a downpour. His face was almost as gray as the sky, and for some reason his brief glance at Monroe made the man look even more uncomfortable. We didn't take a cab. We walked 2 miles down a muddy country lane, keeping our heads down against the driving wind, until we reached the edge of Monroe's property. The road seemed longer than it should have been. Every bend revealed another stretch of empty countryside, another line of dripping trees, another patch of darkness that seemed to move whenever I wasn't looking directly at it. I began to feel that peculiar pressure between my shoulder blades, the instinctive sensation that someone was standing behind me. I would turn slowly, expecting to find a figure between the trees, but there was only rain and darkness. Each time I looked back toward the road, I felt slightly foolish, yet the feeling refused to disappear. We set up our surveillance post inside a dense copse of wet pine trees about 50 yards back from the lane. The cold was brutal, seeping straight through our trousers and soaking our socks within 10 minutes. Water gathered on the branches above us until the weight became too much, then dropped suddenly onto our shoulders with a sharp, startling splash. Each time it happened, Monroe flinched. Across the lane sat Monroe's main house, a gorgeous, warm, 2-story brick place with yellow light glowing behind every window, looking like the picture of domestic comfort. But right across the dirt road stood the target, that dark, rotting, crooked cottage, shuttered up tight, looking abandoned and dead. I couldn't stop staring at it. There was something deeply wrong about seeing those two houses facing one another. One was warm and alive, the other black and silent, and yet the distance between them was so small that a person could cross it in less than a minute. Holmes pulled a brass pocket spyglass from his coat, extended the tubes with a metallic snap, and rested it against the branch of a wet pine, fixing the lens directly on that second-story window. For 2 grueling hours we stood there in the freezing slush, nobody saying a word, our teeth clicking together from the cold. The silence became its own kind of pressure. I began hearing things that probably weren't there, the faint crack of a branch somewhere beyond the trees, a whisper of wind that sounded almost like breathing, the soft movement of wet leaves behind us. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. Then I would look back at the cottage and wonder if something had been watching us while my back was turned. The waiting began to distort time. Seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, and every minute felt like something was deliberately being withheld from us. I became afraid that the first movement I saw would not come from the cottage at all, but from somewhere much closer. At 6:15 p.m., a light flickered inside the upper room, the faint, orange glow of a newly struck match. Monroe's entire body stiffened. A thin silhouette moved behind the filthy lace curtain. And then, slowly, deliberately, the yellow face appeared at the pane. Even through the brass lens, it was horrifying. It didn't move a muscle. It didn't turn its head, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just hung there in the dim candle glow, this flat, featureless, yellow skull staring out into the black rain like a corpse pinned up for display. I felt a cold sensation crawl slowly up the back of my neck. The face seemed impossible to look away from. There was no expression to read, no emotion to understand, yet somehow it felt as though the thing behind the glass was staring directly at each one of us. Monroe's breathing became shallow. Holmes remained perfectly still, and I found myself wondering how long that face had been watching from that window before we arrived. The thought settled into my mind like ice, because the most frightening thing wasn't that we had finally found it. It was the possibility that it had already found us. "That's enough standing in the mud," Holmes barked, snapping his spyglass shut with a loud metallic clatter that made Monroe jump out of his skin. "We don't wait for midnight, Watson. We move right now, while the light is dying, and we've got the element of surprise." The sudden movement almost felt like waking from a nightmare. For a moment, none of us moved. The cottage stood across from us in the fading light, perfectly silent, and I found myself wondering whether entering it was really the same thing as confronting the person inside. There was something about the darkness behind those windows that made my instincts resist every step. We broke out of the tree line, our heavy boots splashing through deep mud puddles, and sprinted straight across the open lane. Monroe was right on our heels, breathing hard, his face pale with a mix of terror and absolute rage. The cottage seemed to grow larger with every step. Its black windows stared down at us. For one irrational second, I had the strange sensation that the yellow face was still watching us from somewhere above, even though I couldn't see it through the darkness. I kept expecting the face to appear again. Every dark pain seemed capable of becoming that face. When we reached the front porch of the cottage, we saw why Monroe hadn't been able to get back in earlier. The front door had been heavily reinforced from the inside. 3 thick pine planks nailed straight across the jamb with heavy iron spikes. Monroe stopped breathing for a moment. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep the world outside. I stared at the barricade and felt an uncomfortable thought forming in my mind. If someone had been hiding inside, they had known exactly what they wanted to keep out. And now we were about to force our way in. Holmes didn't waste a second asking for permission. He stepped onto the porch, unslung his heavy iron crowbar from beneath his cape, jammed the wedge tip straight into the seam between the oak door and the frame, and threw all his weight against the bar. The wood shrieked like a dying animal. Splinters flew everywhere, coating our coat, sleeves, and wet sawdust. Holmes let out a heavy grunt, put his boot against the wall, and levered the bar again. The sound echoed through the cottage. For a moment, there was no response. That silence was somehow worse than noise. I could feel my pulse beating against my fingers around the revolver. I found myself listening for the slightest indication that someone inside had heard us. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No hurried movement. Just that terrible stillness. Then, with a loud, explosive snap, the iron spikes tore clear out of the rotten timber, and the heavy oak door swung wide open, slamming back against the interior wall. The darkness beyond it seemed almost solid. A blast of ice-cold, foul-tasting air hit us right in the face, a heavy, suffocating mix of damp mold, stale carbolic acid, and something sweet and metallic that made my stomach turn right upside down. I instinctively stopped at the threshold. For one strange second, I had the feeling that the darkness had noticed us. It was an irrational thought, but I couldn't shake it. The air inside felt dead, not merely cold, but dead, as though the warmth of ordinary human life had been deliberately pushed out of the building. Holmes raised his lantern. The beam disappeared into the hallway. Monroe swallowed hard behind me. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, we simply stood there listening. The rain behind us, our breathing, the distant groan of the wind. Nothing from inside. That absence of sound made my skin tighten. A house this old should have been full of noises, settling boards, pipes, rats, wind through broken seams. Instead, it seemed to be holding its breath. I looked into the darkness beyond Holmes's shoulder and felt the irrational certainty that something was waiting for us just beyond the reach of the lantern. I tightened my grip around the revolver and tried to convince myself that fear was making ordinary shadows seem alive. But the deeper I looked, the harder it became to believe that we were alone. Holmes stepped forward. I followed. Monroe followed us. and the three of us crossed the threshold into the cottage. I pulled my Webley out of my coat pocket, pulling the hammer back until it clicked into place with a sharp, lethal metallic snap, and stepped over the shattered doorframe right behind Holmes. The sound of that click seemed impossibly loud inside the dead house. For a moment, I had the uncomfortable sensation that the entire building had heard it. Holmes reached into his side pocket, clicked the shutter of his dark lantern open, and sent a sharp, narrow beam of white light cutting through the pitch-black hallway. The place was a total wasteland. The wallpaper was peeling off the plaster in long, wet strips that hung down like skin. The floorboards were covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust crisscrossed by wet boot tracks, and cobwebs hung down from the ceiling rafters like heavy gray drapes. The beam of the lantern moved slowly across the walls. Every shadow seemed to contain the outline of a person. Every dark corner looked deep enough to hide someone. I kept expecting the light to reveal a face staring back at us. It never did. Somehow, that made the darkness feel even more threatening. "Watson, keep your eyes on the dark corners," Holmes muttered under his breath, his voice cold as ice. "Monroe, stay behind us." Monroe obeyed without argument. That alone told me how frightened he was. We began making our way toward the narrow staircase at the back of the hall, taking the steps one by one, keeping our boots jammed up tight against the wall edges so the rotten pine wouldn't groan under our weight. The stairs seemed unnaturally narrow. With each step, I became more aware of the darkness above us. It wasn't simply that we couldn't see what waited there. It was that the darkness appeared to have depth. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the range of the lantern, matching our movements without making a sound. The air got colder the higher we climbed, every breath we dragged in coming out in thick, white clouds of steam. My fingers tightened around the Webley. I could hear Monroe breathing behind me. Then even that sound seemed too loud. I became painfully aware that if something moved behind us, we might not hear it until it was already close. Halfway up the landing, a sound echoed out from the top room. A sharp, gasping cough. I froze. Holmes stopped instantly. Then came the frantic, scraping sound of small, frantic footsteps scrambling across the bare floorboards toward the far wall. The noise was quick and uneven. Terrified. Human enough to be recognizable, yet strange enough in that darkness to make my stomach clench. Someone was trapped up there, panicking like a cornered rat. For a moment, I wondered why whoever was inside hadn't screamed for help. Why had they run instead? And why had they stopped so suddenly? I looked at Holmes. His face had become completely unreadable. Monroe couldn't hold back anymore. He pushed past me on the narrow stairs, his face twisted into a mask of pure fury, shouting his wife's name at the top of his lungs into the roaring dark. "Effie." His voice traveled up the staircase and disappeared into the room above. For one horrible second, nobody answered. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Monroe shouted again. The darkness gave him nothing back. I felt the hairs rise along my arms. The house seemed to be listening. Every creak beneath our feet sounded like movement. Every breath sounded like another person standing somewhere close. Holmes lifted the lantern higher. The light reached the top landing. There was nothing visible, but the footsteps had stopped. That was the part that disturbed me most. Whatever had been running had suddenly gone completely still. I stared into the empty landing, trying to convince myself that the silence meant safety. It didn't. It felt more like whatever had been moving up there had simply realized we were coming. Monroe took another step. I raised my revolver, and together we climbed toward the room where the sound had disappeared. Monroe didn't even bother turning the brass knob. He threw his entire broad shoulder straight into the bedroom door at the top of the landing. The weak pine latch snapped like a toothpick, and the door flew back, bouncing off the wall. We spilled into the small, low-ceilinged room, Holmes sweeping his lantern beam back and forth across the darkness. For one terrible instant, I expected something to rush at us from the shadows. Nothing did. The sudden stillness was almost worse. The room was practically bare, just a single iron cot in the corner with a rough wool blanket, an oil lamp flickering on a bedside stool, and a small wooden chest of drawers pushed against the far wall. The flame of the lamp trembled. Its weak light seemed incapable of reaching the corners. I found myself staring into those corners, waiting for them to reveal whatever the lantern couldn't reach. Standing pressed flat against the plaster wall, cornered like an animal, was a tiny, frail figure dressed in an oversized, heavy tweed coat that dragged on the floor. The figure had its back slammed up against the wall, its chest heaving up and down in absolute terror. For a moment, nobody moved. The small figure didn't move either. I could hear the rapid breathing beneath the coat. Then I saw what was sitting on its shoulders, and my stomach dropped. Sitting right there on its shoulders, illuminated by the harsh beam of our lantern, was the yellow face. Up close, under the direct light, the grotesque reality of the thing slammed into us like a freight train. It wasn't skin at all. It was a crude, heavy papier-mâché mask, painted over with a sickly, yellow enamel paint that was cracking along the cheekbones. Two jagged, hand-cut eye holes stared blankly out at us, and a bright red, unnatural smile was slapped across the chin with cheap oil paint. The discovery should have brought relief. Instead, for several seconds, I was more frightened than before, because beneath the mask was a living person, a small one, terrified, and somehow that made the whole thing more disturbing. The figure lifted two tiny, trembling hands wearing oversized gray wool gloves, and clutched the sides of the yellow mask, pulling it tight against its head as if trying to hide behind the painted cardboard. The gloves shook so violently that the mask rattled faintly against the face. That tiny sound seemed to fill the entire room. Nobody spoke. I could hear the little figure breathing. Fast, shallow, desperate. Holmes's lantern remained fixed on it. The yellow paint looked even more unnatural beneath the harsh white beam. Those crude black eye holes gave the mask an expression it wasn't actually capable of having. It looked frightened, or perhaps my own mind was simply forcing an emotion onto it. I couldn't stop staring at those holes. There was something deeply unsettling about not being able to see the eyes behind them, not knowing whether the person beneath the mask was looking at Holmes, at Monroe, or directly at me. Monroe stood frozen near the doorway. His anger had disappeared. For the first time since we'd entered the cottage, he looked completely lost. The tiny figure pressed harder against the wall. There was nowhere left for it to retreat. Its shoulders trembled. The room seemed to shrink around all of us. Even the rain outside sounded distant now, as though the entire world had moved away and left the four of us trapped inside that small room. I became painfully aware of how quiet everyone had become. One sudden movement could break the silence. One word could make the frightened figure react, and none of us seemed willing to be the first to do it. And as I watched those small gloved hands clutch the mask, one thought kept repeating itself in my mind. Whatever was underneath that yellow face had been more afraid of us than we had ever been of it. Holmes stepped into the room, his long shadow stretching across the ceiling behind him. His voice dropped down to a low, dead-steady register that commanded absolute control. "Enough of the dramatic nonsense," he said quietly, taking a slow step toward the corner with his long arm outstretched. "Take it off. Right now." The tiny figure pulled back, its head hitting the plaster wall with a dull thud, letting out a faint, terrified whimper. The sound was so small that it almost disappeared beneath the rain outside. But I heard it. So did Monroe. The childlike sound changed something in the room. Until then, the yellow mask had allowed my imagination to fill in the worst possibilities. Now there was unmistakable fear behind it. For one brief moment, I wondered what could frighten someone that badly. The figure seemed to shrink into the wall, as though it believed the plaster itself might open and swallow it. I could see its chest rising and falling beneath the heavy coat, each breath quicker than the last. No one seemed willing to move. No one seemed certain what would happen if the silence finally broke. But before Holmes could lay a finger on the cardboard edge, a frantic rush of footsteps came tearing up the stairs behind us. Every man in the room turned. The bedroom door was thrown wide open, and Effie Monroe came sprinting into the light. Her hair was completely unraveled, soaked through with rain and sticking to her pale cheeks. Her clothes were splattered with mud, and her eyes were wild with a terror that made Monroe's look like nothing. She threw herself straight between Holmes and the corner, spreading her arms wide, shielding the tiny masked figure with her own body. "No, Grant, don't do it. For the love of God, don't look," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the narrow ceiling like a wounded animal. "I'll leave. I'll take the child and go back to America. I'll never lay eyes on you again. Just don't tear my heart out right here." Her voice broke on the last words. Monroe stared at her. For a moment, he seemed unable to understand what he was seeing. The room had become so still that I could hear water dripping from Effie's clothes onto the floorboards. Each drop seemed to mark another second in which nobody knew what the truth would look like. Holmes didn't flinch, didn't yell, and didn't back down. He didn't use an ounce of force either. He simply stepped around her trembling shoulder, reached out his long hand, snagged the thin elastic string holding the yellow mask behind the head, and gently pulled it free. The heavy papier-mâché mask slipped off the face, bounced off the tweed coat, and dropped to the bare floorboards with a hollow, wooden clatter. That sound seemed enormous. The mask rolled slightly before coming to rest face up. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Effie stood completely still. The tiny figure remained pressed against the wall. I could hear the rain outside. I could hear Monroe breathing. And for a few seconds, I felt as though the entire room was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The yellow mask lay on the floor between us. A moment earlier, it had been the most terrifying thing in the cottage. Now it looked strangely pathetic. Yet the fear it had created hadn't disappeared. It was still inside the room, still inside us. The silence seemed to press against my ears, and I found myself watching the figure beneath the oversized coat, waiting for the smallest movement. I couldn't see the face clearly yet, but I could feel the weight of everyone's attention fixed on it. There was something unbearable about that pause, something that made me almost wish the mask were still there. Because taking away the mask hadn't yet answered the most frightening question: who had been forced to wear it? Holmes lowered his hand. Effie closed her eyes. Monroe stared toward the corner, and slowly, almost painfully, the figure beneath the coat became visible. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody in that room breathed. The air went completely dead, cold, and still. Standing pressed against that plaster wall wasn't some deformed criminal, wasn't a bitter ex-husband come back to extort money, and wasn't a monster born of a nightmare. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing an oversized coat that swallowed her tiny frame. She had giant, beautiful dark brown eyes, soft jet black curls framed around her face, and skin that was a deep, rich, gorgeous dark brown. She stood there trembling, her bottom lip quivering in absolute terror, looking at all of us with huge, innocent eyes before reaching out her tiny gloved hand to grab a tight handful of her mother's skirt. For a moment, I couldn't move. After everything we had imagined inside that house, the truth seemed almost impossible to accept. The yellow face had occupied my thoughts for hours, and now it had vanished completely, leaving behind a child who looked as frightened by us as we had been of her. I felt a strange shame at how quickly my mind had turned fear into something monstrous. The sight of her made the room feel suddenly smaller. All the frightening possibilities Holmes had described seemed to collapse at once. There was no monster. There was no criminal lurking behind the mask. There was only a frightened child who had been hiding in an abandoned cottage. Yet the fear didn't disappear immediately. It lingered in the room like an echo, attached to every dark corner and every memory of that yellow face at the window. For several seconds, I couldn't stop looking at the mask on the floor and then back at Lucy. It was difficult to understand how something so simple had allowed our minds to create something so terrible. Effie dropped to her knees right there on the filthy floorboards, wrapped her arms around the little girl, buried her face in the child's shoulder, and broke down into heavy, violent, gut-wrenching sobs. The girl clung to her mother as if letting go would make the entire nightmare begin again. Her small fingers tightened into Effie's wet clothes, and she refused to look at any of us. The whole dark mystery collapsed right in front of us. Effie's first husband in Georgia hadn't been some villain. He was a brilliant black lawyer in Atlanta who had fallen victim to the yellow fever outbreak back in '88. He died, but their little daughter, Lucy, had survived. When Effie moved back to England and fell head over heels in love with Grant Monroe, she was gripped by a suffocating, terrifying fear. She knew the deep, ugly prejudices of Victorian high society and feared that if Monroe or his prominent family found out she'd had a child with a black man, they'd reject her, brand her an outcast, and destroy her marriage. So she paid a trusted old nurse £100 to bring the girl over to England on a steamship, rented the empty cottage across the lane so she could visit her child in secret at night, and forced the little girl to wear that yellow mask whenever she went near the windows so the nosy country neighbors wouldn't see her skin and ruin her life. As the truth came together, I found myself looking at the mask lying on the floor. Only minutes earlier it had looked monstrous. Now it looked cruel in an entirely different way. The yellow paint was cracked. The eye holes were uneven. The red smile was crude. And yet that ridiculous object had been enough to turn a frightened little girl into a thing of nightmares in the minds of everyone who saw her. I wondered how many nights Lucy had stood behind that window wearing it, listening to the world outside while knowing she couldn't show her own face. That thought made my stomach tighten. Lucy kept her face buried against Effie's shoulder. Monroe still hadn't moved. His expression was impossible to read. The rain continued tapping against the window. For all the fear we had carried into that cottage, the room was now filled with another kind of silence. The silence that comes when people finally understand what they were actually afraid of. Not a monster, not a ghost, not some evil creature hiding in the dark, but the possibility of what cruel people might do to an innocent child simply because she existed. And somehow that realization was more painful than the mystery itself. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody in that room breathed. The air went completely dead, cold, and still. Standing pressed against that plaster wall wasn't some deformed criminal, wasn't a bitter ex-husband come back to extort money, and wasn't a monster born of a nightmare. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing an oversized coat that swallowed her tiny frame. She had giant, beautiful dark brown eyes, soft jet black curls framed around her face, and skin that was a deep, rich, gorgeous dark brown. She stood there trembling, her bottom lip quivering in absolute terror, looking at all of us with huge, innocent eyes before reaching out her tiny gloved hand to grab a tight handful of her mother's skirt. For a moment, I couldn't move. After everything we had imagined inside that house, the truth seemed almost impossible to accept. The yellow face had occupied my thoughts for hours, and now it had vanished completely, leaving behind a child who looked as frightened by us as we had been of her. I felt a strange shame at how quickly my mind had turned fear into something monstrous. The sight of her made the room feel suddenly smaller. All the frightening possibilities Holmes had described seemed to collapse at once. There was no monster. There was no criminal lurking behind the mask. There was only a frightened child who had been hiding in an abandoned cottage. Yet the fear didn't disappear immediately. It lingered in the room like an echo, attached to every dark corner and every memory of that yellow face at the window. For several seconds, I couldn't stop looking at the mask on the floor and then back at Lucy. It was difficult to understand how something so simple had allowed our minds to create something so terrible. Effie dropped to her knees right there on the filthy floorboards, wrapped her arms around the little girl, buried her face in the child's shoulder, and broke down into heavy, violent, gut-wrenching sobs. The girl clung to her mother as if letting go would make the entire nightmare begin again. Her small fingers tightened into Effie's wet clothes, and she refused to look at any of us. The whole dark mystery collapsed right in front of us. Effie's first husband in Georgia hadn't been some villain. He was a brilliant black lawyer in Atlanta who had fallen victim to the yellow fever outbreak back in '88. He died, but their little daughter, Lucy, had survived. When Effie moved back to England and fell head over heels in love with Grant Monroe, she was gripped by a suffocating, terrifying fear. She knew the deep, ugly prejudices of Victorian high society and feared that if Monroe or his prominent family found out she'd had a child with a black man, they'd reject her, brand her an outcast, and destroy her marriage. So she paid a trusted old nurse £100 to bring the girl over to England on a steamship, rented the empty cottage across the lane so she could visit her child in secret at night, and forced the little girl to wear that yellow mask whenever she went near the windows so the nosy country neighbors wouldn't see her skin and ruin her life. As the truth came together, I found myself looking at the mask lying on the floor. Only minutes earlier it had looked monstrous. Now it looked cruel in an entirely different way. The yellow paint was cracked. The eye holes were uneven. The red smile was crude. And yet that ridiculous object had been enough to turn a frightened little girl into a thing of nightmares in the minds of everyone who saw her. I wondered how many nights Lucy had stood behind that window wearing it, listening to the world outside while knowing she couldn't show her own face. That thought made my stomach tighten. Lucy kept her face buried against Effie's shoulder. Monroe still hadn't moved. His expression was impossible to read. The rain continued tapping against the window. For all the fear we had carried into that cottage, the room was now filled with another kind of silence. The silence that comes when people finally understand what they were actually afraid of. Not a monster, not a ghost, not some evil creature hiding in the dark, but the possibility of what cruel people might do to an innocent child simply because she existed. And somehow that realization was more painful than the mystery itself.